As disputes between Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria grew immensely, they grew hostile towards each other. Many fights began to break out between the states, and countless of the multiple states' monumental buildings became overrun by opposing Israeli forces. In the end, Israel came out successful and overtook the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The war not only influenced other revolutions to aspire inside many of the nations, it gave some recognition towards many of the religions and the social problems that lied inside. Now, this all didn't happen in one day, nor in one month. It's an accumulative process that happened over years.
Israel expressed a desire to negotiate with its neighbors. Finally, in an address to the UN General Assembly on October 10, 1960, the Foreign Minister Golda Meir asked Arab leaders to meet with the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to negotiate a peace settlement. The Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser answered on October 15, saying that Israel was attempting to go against world opinion and reiterating that his country would never recognize the Jewish state. The Arabians were just as equal in their refusal to negotiate a separate settlement for the refugees.
In 1963, the Arab League decided to introduce a new weapon in its war against Israel, known as the Palestine Liberation Organization, shortened as the PLO. The PLO was created during a 1964 meeting of the First Palestinian Congress. Shortly after, the group began to split into various different factions. In the end, the largest faction, Fatah, would begin to dominate the entire organization. The leader, Yasser Arafat, would become the PLO chairman and became known as the group's symbol. All the smaller groups had to follow a set of principles laid out by the Palestine National Charter, which impacted the calling of Israel's destruction. Terrorist attacks by the group grew exponentially, and by 1965, 35 raids were conducted against Israel. The following year, the number jumped up to 41. The following year after that, 37 attacks were launched in just the first few months. Most of the attacks involved Palestinian guerrillas infiltrating through Israel from the Gaza Strip, Jordan, and Lebanon. The president's main objective was to harass the Israelis, while a secondary objective was to lower the control that King Hussein held over in Jordan. In September 1965, Arab leaders and their military and intelligence chiefs met secretly at the Casablanca Hotel in Morocco to discuss whether they were ready to go to war against Israel and if they should create a joint Arab command. The host of the meeting, King Hassan II, did not trust the Arab League guests initially and had planned to let a joint Shin Bet Mossad unit, known as the Bird Spy, on the conference. But a day before the conference, he had told them to leave in fear that they would get caught or noticed by the Arab guests. So then Hassan decided to record the conference secretly and give it to the Israelis. Here's a quote from the head of the research departments of Israel's Military Intelligence Directorate, Major General Shlomo Gazit. These recordings were truly an extraordinary intelligence achievement. Further showed us that on the other hand, the Arab states were heading toward a conflict that we must prepare for. On the other hand, the rambling about Arab unity and having a united front against Israel didn't reflect real unanimity among them. The breakup of the UAR and the political instability caused after it only made Syria more hostile toward Israel. Another major cause of conflict was the resistance that Syria did towards Israel's creation of a national water carrier to take water from the Jordan River to supply the country. The Syrian army used the Golan Heights, a terrain that towers 3,000 feet above the Galilee that shelters Israeli farms and villages. Syria's attacks grew more frequent in 1965 and 1966. Forcing people living on kibbutzim, a collective community in Israel that was based on agriculture, to sleep inside of bomb shelters. Israel repeatedly protested the Syrian bombardments to the UN Mixed Armistice Commission, which was charged with policing the ceasefire, but the UN did nothing to stop Syria's aggressive natures. Meanwhile, this was happening. Israel was condemned by the United Nations.
Syria's attacks on Israeli kibbutzim from the Golan Heights finally ended, but not without a retaliatory strike on April 7, 1967. During the attack, Israeli planes shot down 6 Syrian fighter planes. Shortly thereafter, the Soviets gave Damascus false information alleging a massive Israeli military buildup in preparation for an attack. Despite Israeli denials, Syria decided to invoke its defense treaty with Egypt and asked Nasser to come to its aid.
Despite the confidence among military leaders, the government made preparations for mass temporary graves for tens of thousands of victims in Tel Aviv, but journalists were threatened to not publish by military guidelines and censoring. On June 4, 1967, the Israeli cabinet met and voted unanimously to give the defense ministry approval to declare their position on how to respond to the attacks and oppression of Egypt. On June 5th of the same year, Israel was isolated, but the military commanders had come up with a war strategy that could majorly impact the outcome of the war. The entire Israeli Air Force, with the exception of just 12 fighters assigned to defend the Israeli airspace, took off at 7:14 a.m. They left in an operation known as Operation Moked, also titled Operation Focus, with the sole purpose of bombing Egyptian airfields while the pilots off the field were eating breakfast. By 11:05 a.m., 180 Egyptian fighter planes were destroyed. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan was not planning to attack Syria until the Syrians struck Tiberias and Megiddo first. Israeli fighters attacked the Syrian and Jordanian air forces as well as one of the airfields in Iraq. By the end of the first day, half of the Syrian and more than half of the Egyptian air forces had been destroyed. Altogether, Israel claimed to have destroyed 20 Jordanian, 302 Egyptian, and 52 Syrian aircrafts. Controversy sparked after Moshe Dayan refused to let the reports leak of the bombing due to him wanting Israel to stay viewed as the victim for as long as possible. The battle continued to this time on the ground, but some of history's greatest known tank battles were fought between Egyptian and Israeli in the scorching conditions in the Sinai Desert. On June 9th at 5:45 a.m., the head of the Southern Command, Major General Yashu Gavish, informed the Chief of Staff, the IDF forces on the banks on the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. The Sinai Peninsula is in our hands. Congratulations. At 2 a.m. on June 6, 1 Brigade 55's 3 battalions attacked the Jordanian position known as Ammunition Hill and fought one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The paratroopers shot their way through minefields and cut through layers of razor wire fences. 7 soldiers were killed and more than a dozen were injured. The Israelis had not trained for trench warfare and had to improvise. 2 soldiers jumped on tanks and ordered them up the hill, firing at every Jordanian soldier they spotted. Years later, a Jordanian soldier had admitted the tanks had convinced the rest of the soldiers that the battle was lost and that they must retreat from the hill. It had taken 3 hours to capture the Jordanian command bunker. Of the 260 soldiers who fought at Ammunition Hill, only 11 emerged out without being wounded or killed. 36 died. The Jordanians lost 71 men. After the battle, the Israelis buried 17 Jordanian soldiers in a mass grave with the English inscription, "Here lay 17 brave Jordanian soldiers, IDF 1967. While forbidding the army from entering the Old City, Eshkol said if the connection to Mount Scopus is completed this morning, the West Bank should be conquered up to the peak mountain ridges while enabling escape routes for civilians. Palestinians took advantage of those routes to flee eastward to escape fire. The night after the battle on Ammunition Hill, Dayan and Uzi Narkis, the commander responsible for combating the Jordanian forces, met on Mount Scopus to discuss how they might take the Old City.
Dayan realized that he had to make a decision. At 6:15 a.m. on June the 7th, Dayan ordered the encirclement of the Old City and instructed the army to enter it with the warning not to damage any of the holy places that lied inside. The night before, most of the Jordanian troops had retreated, so when paratroopers stormed the gate into Via Dolorosa, they were met with no resistance. Gur led the charge up to the Temple Mount and radioed headquarters at 10:08 a.m. The joy of reunited Jerusalem was seized by the loss of so many soldiers. A total of 430 paratroopers were wounded and 97 were killed. Hussein's decision changed the course of the war in history. Following the shelling of Jerusalem, Israel countered and took over the West Bank of Jordan within 48 hours. According to Major General Raphael Vardi, the Palestinians believed that Jordanians and other Arab forces were going to quickly occupy Israel. Such was their surprises that the Israeli forces that entered Nablus were welcomed by the population with flowers and with flags, because they believed that they were Iraqi forces that had come to support the Jordanians.
While most IDF units were fighting the Egyptians and Jordanians, a small group of soldiers were left to defend the northern border against the Syrians. It was not until the Jordanians and Egyptians were subdued that reinforcements could be sent to the Golan Heights, where Syrian gunners commanding the strategic high ground made it exceedingly difficult and costly for Israeli forces to penetrate through. Finally, on June 9th, after 2 days of heavy air bombardment, Israeli forces succeeded in breaking through the Syrian forces' lines.
After 6 days of fighting, Israeli forces were in a position to march on Cairo, Damascus, and Amman. By this time, the principal objectives of capturing the Sinai and Golan Heights had been accomplished, and Israeli political leaders had no desire to fight the Arab capitals. Furthermore, the Soviet Union had become increasingly alarmed by the Israeli advances and was threatening them to intervene. At this point, the U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, advised the Israelis in the strongest possible terms to accept a ceasefire on June the 10th. Israel did just that.
The victory came at a very high cost. In storming the Golan Heights, Israel suffered 115 dead. Altogether, Israel lost twice as many men, 777 dead and 2,586 wounded. Also, despite the incredible success of their air battles, the Israeli Air Force lost 46 of its 200 fighters. The death toll on the Arab side was 15,000 Egyptians, 2,500 Syrians, and 800 Jordanians. By the end of the war, Israel had conquered enough territory to expand the size of the area they controlled threefold, from 8,000 to 26,000 square miles. The victory enabled Israel to unify Jerusalem. Israeli forces had also captured the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank.
A surprising victory, and an outcome that was not seen by many. A treaty was signed in November 1967, a treaty that allowed a formula for Arab-Israeli peace, whereby Israel would withdraw from territories occupied in the war in exchange for peace with its neighbors. This resolution was served as the base for peace negotiations from that time on. Conflicts to this present day still happen in the regions, not learning from their mistakes. Almost immediately after the end of the war, any hope for peace was broken when Egypt began shelling Israeli positions near the Suez Canal, before a ceasefire was declared 3 years later. 1,424 Israeli soldiers and more than 100 civilians were killed. Egypt suffered approximately 5,000 dead. This final battle concludes the short-lived but terrifying conflict that will ever be written in the history books everywhere as the 6 Day War.